Hey everyone, let's get started. Today we are going to cover securing Azure SQL Web APIs with App Builder and Azure Key Vault. This is a slightly different webinar than we've done in the past. Though we have the same hosts, of course, myself, Brian's online, Zdravko's online, George is online, Constantine, Pablo, the whole product team's online. But I actually recorded the demo for today, and so it's a recorded sort of thing because it is very complex, and it, in normal circumstances, probably would have been an hour and a half demo, but I wanted to get it in. So I squeezed in the actual demo part to around 45 minutes. But we're all online live, so you're getting live Q&A along with this. But it is a killer demo, and hopefully it gives you some insight on how to use these cloud tools and then how you can use App Builder, which the App Builder story is going to be the same as you've seen in the past. And then we've covered some of this in other webinars, but I think it's a pretty cool example. And I also learned a lot too doing it. So today's agenda, we're going to do this end-to-end from scratch. We're going to create an Azure SQL database. We're actually going to migrate from SQL Express to the cloud. We're going to create and deploy a web API app. We are going to get everything working in terms of the app, the database from our local machine. Then we're going to deploy it to the cloud, and then we're going to use Azure Key Vault to encrypt the connection string. So there's no connection string in your application code, and it's all in the cloud in a secure environment. And then, of course, we're going to consume that data right inside of App Builder. But before we get to that, I want to highlight Q4 2022 is big for App Builder. There is a bit.ly link and a QR code that you can go and read Rado's blog on the new features that we shipped in 22.2, but there's more coming in the next couple of weeks, and we hope to get it all in, but if it kind of gets into January, it'll be very early January. But we've got new web components code generation. So the web components is now getting code generated. You have another option in your code generation in App Builder. We've got updated Blazor code gen. Of course, we have that brand new Blazor grid, the most feature-rich, high-performance Blazor grid on the market. It will blow you away if you haven't seen it, with all the theming and everything, all that good stuff. If you haven't seen our What's New 22.2 webinar, make sure you check that out. Coming soon, new pivot grid inside of App Builder. Coming soon, column templates are coming soon in App Builder. We shipped column configuration, so you can change column configuration right inside App Builder on the canvas, but we're going to ship column configuration so you can do column templates, so you can actually do column templates, which is killer, because sometimes you want right in App Builder to add an image, add a spark line, do something special. You'll be able to do that with column templates. Chart aggregations, which is a feature that I demoed in several webinars on how you can take lots of data and aggregate it right within the chart data engine. That is now inside of App Builder. Grid CRUD, this is the one that's on the fence, may ship, may not ship, but needless to say, Grid CRUD is coming soon. And then finally, hierarchical data. The App Builder only supports flat data, but with hierarchical data, it opens up a lot of new options like the hierarchical grid. So anyway, keep an eye on the December blogs for App Builder, because we're pretty excited about some of the stuff that we're shipping. And go back and watch the 22.2 What's New webinar if you haven't. Scan the QR code to read Rado's blog. So good things happening with App Builder. We aren't slowing down. But for today, what are we going to do? I put together this diagram of all the things that you're going to see today. So starting from the left-hand side, we are looking at a Visual Studio Web API, .NET 6 Web API app with minimal API connecting to SQL Server. We're going to do a simple HTTP GET. We're going to have a single table, a single view in SQL Server, and we're going to serve that up over a Swagger UI. Then we are going to push that code to GitHub. And then inside of GitHub, you have your normal check-in, check-out stuff. But the neat thing is, once we actually deploy that API app in Azure, we are going to trigger a continuous delivery script inside of GitHub. So every time we check in our code in Visual Studio, our code in Azure gets updated Along with that, we're going to do that SQL migration. That's one of the first things we're going to do is get that database up in Azure. And then at the very end of the webinar, after we get all the Key Vault stuff working, all the encryption working, we'll push the code one last time, and then we will just consume that API from App Builder. And that part of the demo is like, of course, 30 seconds. That's the easy part. The hard part is getting everything set up. But you can see today that this demo is about 45 minutes without some of the editing that I did, because, like, for example, when you update the Visual Studio Code and you check it into GitHub, and then you're doing a script, the continuous delivery is happening with Azure, that could take like 5 minutes, because it's not up to you. It's up to GitHub, and it's up to Azure, and it's up to the cloud. So while all of this is automated, it doesn't often happen in 5 seconds or 2 seconds like it would locally. For example, when you deploy the SQL database, it could take Azure 5 minutes to finally deploy it. When we submit the web API, it could take 5 minutes for Azure to deploy it. So that's why I did this webinar a little bit different today. But I think you're going to be blown away by everything that you see. It's pretty exciting and was really fun to put together. So make sure you ask all of the questions inside of the chat and the Q&A. Of course, the webinar will be available on YouTube tomorrow. We will email you a link to it, so if you can't watch it all or you want to send it around to your friends, you will get a link as soon as it's uploaded to YouTube. So let's go ahead and get started and create the database, consume it from a web API, secure it with Azure Key Vault, and then consume everything inside of an App Builder app. In this example, we are going to use Azure SQL as the database. So here I have a database in SQL Express on my local machine, and I am going to migrate that to Azure SQL. The autos table will select the first 1,000 rows. It's really only 500 rows of data, and it's probably got, I don't know, 15 or 25 columns. So to get started, let's go ahead and go to our Azure portal. So here I have my Azure portal, and I am going to go to my resource groups, and I'm going to create a new resource group. And in this resource group, we're going to create a database. We're going to create a web API application that we're going to get from GitHub, which we're going to create in Visual Studio, and we are going to add our Azure Key Vault. So let's go ahead and click Create, and we're going to create a new resource group. We'll just call it New Demo Group, and the East region is fine. Next, we have no tags, and so we'll just go ahead and hit Create, and this will create our resource group. So let's go to our resource group. Now inside of our resource group, we want to add our SQL Server. So let's go ahead and click Create again. And in the marketplace, let's just type in SQL. And Azure SQL pops up first. So let's go ahead and click the Create button, Azure SQL. And we'll create a single database. I'm going to click Create. And now we're going to add this to the resource group that we just created. So I already have a resource group for another application set called SQL Server Resource Group. We're going to put this to the New Demo Group. And the database name will be called Autos Test DB. And the server, we're not going to put it in JBaris East. We're going to create a new server. And this will be called Autos DB Server. And we will use both SQL Server and Azure Active Directory authentication. Oh, you'll notice here your server can only contain lowercase letters. So I always forget that. Let's go ahead and fix this. I don't know why they don't fix that for you. But for our login, I'll go ahead and use a login that I will remember. Like so. I'll set the admin, and the admin for this Azure directory is going to be me. And we'll select myself. And now that is the admin for this SQL Server database. We'll click OK. And now the next thing that we want to do is make sure that we're not going to get charged $227 a month I have the free Azure tier, which I believe gives me $150 a month. So I'm going to change this to a development database, and I'm going to configure it to the service tier of DTU based, which is for less demanding workloads, perfect for demos or small databases or things that not many people have to access. I'll go ahead and click apply, and that will charge me, I think, around $4.90 a month, and locally redundant. Next, for networking, we're going to allow the public endpoint. We want to allow Azure services to access this server. We want to make sure that my IP address can be used for this specific database. So if you try to connect to this, you won't be able to. And I'll click security next. And I don't believe I want any of that. Click next for additional settings. I have data already, so we're not going to use the sample data. Tags, nothing. Review and create. And everything looks like it should. $4.90 is good. And let's go ahead and click create. So this usually takes a minute. But what it's doing is it's actually going to create that database in the resource group that I created. So we'll wait for that to complete, and then we'll go back to SQL Server Management Studio, and we will migrate our local SQL Express database to Azure SQL. You see the deployment is just wrapping up, and the deployment is complete. So let's go ahead and go to our resource, and we'll be able to use this now. So what we can do and what this defaults to is to start working with your database. There's a couple things that you can actually do. You can open this up in Azure Data Studio and then run a script to add data. They have a beta query editor that you could use to add your tables and views and insert data into those tables, or you can use SQL Server Management Studio. So if I go to SQL Server Management Studio and you go to your database and you right click and you go to tasks, there's an option to deploy database to Microsoft Azure SQL database. So if I click this, I'm going to have a wizard that pops up, and it is going to prompt me for some user ID and etc. info. Another option that you have is if you right click on the database, you have the tasks again, and you can generate scripts. I personally like doing this because then I can modify the scripts if I want. You click generate scripts, and what this will do is allow you to script the database. So here, if I want to script the entire database and all objects, I click next. The one nice thing here is if you click advanced and you scroll down to types of data to script, you can select schema and data and click OK. And I will open this in a new query editor window, and I'll click next, and it does it for me here. So we'll finish, and you can see that it does the create table. And this actually did the create database and everything. But here's my create table. Here's my create view here. And then this is the insert statements for all of the data that I have in the database, all 500 records. What we'll do, since we've never tried this before, is we'll right click on Auto People. We'll go to Tasks, and we'll go to Deploy Database to an Azure SQL database. So let's go through this wizard. So let's go ahead and connect to our server. So our server is going to be the SQL server that we just created. So if I go back to my overview here, you can see this is called autodbserver.database.windows.net. So I'm going to copy this to the clipboard. Let's go back to our wizard, and I'm going to paste this in. I'm going to use SQL Server Authentication, and I'm going to use my username and password that I typed in, and I'll say remember password. We'll connect, and what we have now is the connection that's successful and a couple questions, the addition, the maximum size. I'm guessing this is the basic. I don't know. I'm going to take the defaults. Let's click next. Here's my source database. There's my target database. And let's just go ahead and click finish, and we'll watch the wizard complete. So it's basically running the same script, and then it's going to run it in the cloud on Azure. So let's watch this happen, and we will look at the results in Azure. So we have success. Everything was deployed to Azure. All the results look good, so we'll close the wizard dialog. And if we go back to our Azure database, we'll be able to look at our SQL databases here. We have auto people and auto test DB. Now keep in mind, when we created the SQL Server itself, we created a database, auto test DB. When we ran the wizard, it created auto people. So auto people is actually the database that has all of the data in it. So if we go to the query editor, let's continue to log in as myself, and we'll expand tables, and we should see our autos table in here. And if we select this, and on the overflow, select top 1000 rows, it will execute the query and we will see our data. So there we go. Now we know we have some data here. So the next thing that we want to do, now that we have the database and the table autos, we want to create a web API in Visual Studio, and then we will deploy that web API to Azure. And after that, we will secure our credentials using Azure Key Vault. So let's go and open up Visual Studio. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio. Let's go ahead and create a new project. We will create an ASP.NET Core Web API project, and we will call this Autos API Demo 1. And we will uncheck to use minimal API, accept the other defaults, and click Create. So here we have our application. If we go to program.cs, we can see we have this boilerplate code, which we always want to delete. So let's delete that. And let's delete that. And there we go. So what we're going to do is use the Entity Framework Power Tools, of course, to generate our entity framework models, and then we'll create the API to access it from the server. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to go to EF Core Power Tools, and I'm going to select Reverse Engineer. So from here, I want to add my database connection. And of course, we need that server name again from Azure. So let's go back to our overview. That's fine. And we will copy the name of the server. And let's paste this in. We will use SQL Server Authentication. And we'll save the password, and we'll select the database. We're going to use auto people, and we will say OK. So we're going to select our table and our views. We'll click OK. And the options here, we will put this in the models directory. That's fine. We'll put this in the data directory or data folder. We have install EF Core package and product, and we also want to select include connection string and generated code. So then we'll have that, and we're not going to leave it in the generated code when we officially deploy it, but you'll see why we will use it in the very beginning. Let's go ahead and click OK and click OK. So the wizard's complete. It created my data context. It created my models. So I've got my autos and my autos view. So all of the hard work of typing all this is done for me by the tool, which I love, Entity Framework Power Tools. You'll also notice that the Power Tools README popped up, and it gave me my connection string information, which I will need to connect to the database. But what I wanted to highlight is that if I go to my data context here, what you'll notice is that the SQL Server connection is also generated here, which means that it will automatically connect to the server when I run my web API. Now, if I run this right now, nothing will happen because there's a couple errors. You can see we've got the red squigglies everywhere. And if we look at all the errors, Entity Framework Core, DB Context, all these things don't exist. So I'm going to right click here. We're going to go to Manage NuGet Packages, and we are going to install what we need to make this work. So we need the Entity Framework. So we can just start typing in Entity Framework Core, and it will come up. So we've got the Entity Framework Core SQL Server we need. We'll click OK and accept the defaults there. And we also just need the Entity Framework Core package, which should be first. There it is. We'll install this guy. And that should do it for us. So yeah, no more errors. Let's close this out. If we build, there should be nothing suspect happening. But when we run it, we won't get anything in our Swagger UI because we haven't added any HTTP GETs yet. So here is our Autos API. It's connected to our SQL Server in the cloud, but it's not doing anything. So what we want to do is go to our program CS, and we need to modify this, which will actually generate that DB context, which will connect to the cloud, which will get our data in our Swagger UI. So the first thing that we need to do is generate that DB context. So here, before builder.build, we want to create our DB context. So we'll do a builder.services.add. What do we want to add? We want to add a DB context. Now we have to tell it which DB context to add. You can see my IntelliSense is trying to guide me in the right direction here, but just so you know, what is your DB context? Let's go to the auto people context, and there is my DB context. It's called auto people context, and this is in the autos API demo1.data. So let's copy this, and we'll go back to our program CS. Up here, let's just say using, and in our add DB context, let's go ahead and add our auto people context, which comes up very nicely. And that's all we need to do. So this will automatically create the DB context, and when it does that, it will create a connection to our SQL Server. Let's go back to program CS. Now we are going to run this locally in Visual Studio, but our data is in the cloud. So here we have if app environment is development, use Swagger UI. I want to use the Swagger UI even if it's not in development, because I want to use it when we deploy it into the cloud as well. We have app.use HTTP redirection. Now we have to add our map get, which will create the API. So I have this already created for us here. So I want to do an app.mapget API auto. So when I type in API/autos, it'll pull that data. That's using map get. Of course, you have map put, map delete, etc. And then we're going to use from services the auto people context.db. We're going to get the autos view, and then we're going to make that an async list, which comes back. So we're just going to update some using statements here. So we have using entity framework core, and then from services is going to be in the MVC namespace. Let's using ASP.NET Core MVC. So that's all we need to do. Let's go ahead and run this now, and let's see what we get. My Swagger UI pops up. Let's go ahead and try this out. Click try it out. Click execute. Scroll down a bit, and we should see some data coming back from the server. Now keep in mind, when you do this yourself, there's always going to be some slight delays because we do have that very low-end development database. But nevertheless, we have data which came back. So you can see I've got all of my fields, ID, title, first name, etc. in the data from the database. So this is awesome. We're almost ready to go. Next step, you do not want to deploy your connection string inside of your app code, because what we're going to do is deploy this to GitHub. And then GitHub is, where everything is at, and anyone can go in there and look at your secure information. So what I want to do is I want to take this and I want to put it in my secrets. If you remember in the Power Tools README, it gave me this connection strings code. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to right click on my project. I'm going to go to Manage User Secrets, and I'm just going to paste this in. And now I have a connection strings default connection. So now it's completely secret, because when you manage user secrets, you'll see secrets.json. This doesn't get deployed to GitHub. It doesn't get deployed with your app. That's why we need to update the connection string in Azure Key Vault so we have a connection string once everything's up in the cloud. So if I now go to my auto people context, we no longer want to use any of this. So I'm going to hit the delete key, and we're done. So let's save. And if we run this, it's not going to work. Why? Because if we go to program.cs, we are adding the default DB context. We don't want to do that. Now we need to use some other options to get the connection string out of our user secrets. So of course, I happen to have a code snippet for that. And let's add the default DB context here. And because This is called default connection, which was the name of our user secret config, which of course, if we go back to our Power Tools README, you'll see it's called default connection. And we go back to program CS. This is part of the builder.configuration.getConnectionString method. So it's saying, get this connection string from a configuration file. What is the configuration file? It's either going to be appsettings.json or it's going to be your user secrets.json. So it'll look in either one of these for whatever configuration you might happen to have. You could have multiple configurations. This happens to be get connection string. What's the connection string? It's called default connection. Now that is the DB context that we want to add. Of course, it's not dev test context. This was something else I was working on. It is the auto people context. So for auto people context, please use this new connection string that we just pulled in. That's all I need to change. Let's save it. Let's run it. And now this will do the same thing that we just saw, except we have our secret secured as a user secret in the application. So we'll try it out. We'll execute. And the best thing to do when you're starting to learn all of this is always make sure you're getting data back, because 9 times out of 10, you're going to forget a step or something's going to be wrong and you're not going to get data. And if you do incrementally testing, by the time it deploys, everything should work okay. So just a little tip there. So let's go ahead and close this. Now, what we want to do is I want to deploy this to GitHub. So GitHub's my source control system. So I'm going to right click and I am going to deploy to a Git repository. So let's click create Git repository. The nice thing is I've done this multiple times. So it is already logged into GitHub. If you haven't done this, you just log in. There's my repo, or not my repo. There's my ID for GitHub. I have several, of course. They don't want me to be a manager on any of these, but I happen to be one, so I can deploy, which is scare some people. But anyway, this Autos API Demo 1 is the name of my project, name of my description. I'm going to keep this private, and I am going to create and push. So let's go ahead and create and push. And this only takes a second, but this is going off to GitHub. And you can see I've got the locks here for everything, and all is good. So if I go to Git changes, there's nothing happening here. And if I go back to Solution Explorer, we're in our program CS, and we can just add a comment like so. And you'll see that I don't have the lock here anymore. And if I wanted to deploy this, I could. I can just say updated comment, and I better change this to the right word here. Like so, and I can commit all my changes, save, and commit them all, and then I can do a pull and then a push, and it automatically updates GitHub. So all this is up in GitHub. Everything is fine. If we want to see it in GitHub, we can go to Edge, and we can go to github.com/jbarris, and we'll go to repositories. And there's my Autos API Demo 1. Now, what is the next step? The next step is to get this as an API app inside of Azure. How do we do that? Let's go back to our Azure portal. So I'm going to go back home, and I'm going to go to my new demo group resource group. Remember, we created this earlier. Here I've got my database and other things. Now from Azure, I want to create a new API app. So let's go ahead and hit create. What do I want to create? We're going to search for API. And there's API management, but I want the Azure API app. So let's click create on an Azure API app. And we have another wizard here. So let's enter the app name. The name of our project, I think, was Autos API Demo 1. Let's see if that'll work for us. Autos API Demo 1. Looks good. Publish code, runtime stack. We'll use the current version of .NET. Region, I'm in the Eastern US. We'll use Eastern US. My Windows plan, this is the ASP SQL Server Resource Group. I do not want to put it there. I want to create a new one, and this will just be called Autos API like so. Click OK. And this is a standard S1 1.7 gig of memory. If we click change size, this is a production one, which is probably going to cost me some money. 43 bucks a month is way too much, so I'm going to click dev test, and this is going to be a shared 1 gigabyte of memory, 60 minutes of compute per day, which is perfect for me. So let's go ahead and apply that, and the magic word here is free. So let's click next for deployment. Now, this is what is so cool. I've already done this before, but so it knows that I've got a GitHub account. So what I want to do is enable continuous deployment. You hear about CI, CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment. That's what we're doing here. So I have my GitHub account here, Jay Barris. If I want to change it, I could. I'm not going to. I'm going to select the Jay Barris organization. And now I'm going to select the Autos API Demo 1 repository that we just deployed. And I want to pull from the master branch. Now, what is this doing? It's going to create a YAML script in my GitHub repo, which will trigger a continuous deployment every time I check in new code, which is magical. So let's go to networking, enable network injection off, monitoring. I think we just leave all the defaults here. Enable, no, I don't want application insights. I don't need tags. Everything looks good. I'm just taking all the defaults and I'm going to click create. So now this is deploying my application. So this will take a few minutes while the application's getting deployed, but at the same time, it is updating my GitHub repository with some new code, with some new scripts, and then those new scripts will trigger every time I actually run this guy. So you can see deployment is still in progress. There's my Auto API resource plan that we created, and now we'll just wait for this to finish up and we'll take a look at what we got. So our deployment is complete. Let's go to our resource, and this is our Autos API Demo 1. Now, when you're here, there is no code, so it's not like you're looking at code or running code. This is actually a running web API at this point. So you have a URL, Autos API demo1.azurewebsites.net. So if I click this, you'll get either an error or some default page. So it says your web app is running and waiting for your content. But what we want to do is use our Swagger URL. So if I do a /Swagger, I get an error. It's temporary unavailable. If you get that, you can always try Swagger /index.html. That might not work. If that doesn't work, you can also check to see if the application is just maybe there's something wrong with the Swagger page. You can also try API, and I think our API name was Autos, and nothing seems to work yet. So what usually happens here is the website says it's ready and deployed, but it's really not. So you have to wait a few minutes. You shouldn't. So if I click this and you get this page, that means it's really not running yet. That means that, this is sort of like a please hold page. What you should get is a straight up error. I think it's a 404 error on this page. So we will go do one other thing in the meantime. So one of the things that we need to do is give this application permission to have an identity within Active Directory. So what I want to do is I want to select the identity tab, and you can see that there's no system assigned identity. I want to switch this to on, and you'll see why when we add our Azure Key Vault, because we want to associate the Key Vault with an application, and that's all done through Active Directory. So that's what we're going to do there, and we are good to go. So we're not going to do anything to our code in Visual Studio until we see that our application is actually up and running. So let's go back to Overview. Whoops, is there? Oh, there's the Save button. Make sure you hit Save. So this is enabling my Autos API, and there's my Azure role assignments. So this register with Active Directory. That is the important thing. It does not do that by default, and you will run into problems adding a Key Vault if you don't do that. So make sure you do it. Let's go back over here, and let's see what's going on with our application. Perfect. So you can see we get an error, 404. That means our app is actually deployed. How do we know that? Let's go to Swagger /index.html and hit enter, And there's our Swagger UI. So you have just deployed an application to the cloud in Azure with a web API. Now let's try it out. Try it out. Notice we have the schema here because Swagger has the schema. We'll click execute, and what's going to happen? We get an error. So we have error 500, internal server error. And for everyone that's savvy, it's because our user secrets don't get deployed. There is no DB context. There is no connection string. It has no idea where to get its data from at this point. So that's why we add the Key Vault. So let's go back home and let's go to resource groups. And we are going to go to our new demo resource group. We are going to select create. And what we want to create is a Key Vault. So let's type in Key Vault. And you can see here we've got the Microsoft Azure Key Vault service. So let's click this guy. And now again, we are going to create this object, and then we're going to run through a wizard asking us a few questions to set up this Key Vault within our application. And then we're going to use this Key Vault in the app. So it already knows our resource group. We're in the new demo resource group. We're going to call this one Autos Key Vault Demo 1. And we need this. So I'm going to copy this and paste it off to the side because we'll need that later. Standard pricing, Eastern US. Just accept all the defaults here. We'll click next. And this is where it gets quite important for that identity that we added. You'll notice that from a user perspective, jasonb@infragistics.com has a bunch of different permissions on this Key Vault, but we need our application to have permissions as well. So I'm going to click create, and we need to have secret permissions enabled, get and list, because that's what we're going to do. We're telling the Key Vault to go ahead and get this information from the Key Vault and then allow me to use it from my application. So I'm going to say get and list under secret. I'm going to say next. And now it wants to know what principal to associate this with. So let's just type in auto, and lo and behold, there is our Autos API Demo 1. So that's what I was talking about. If you don't enable the principal object on the web API that you just deployed, it won't come up here, and you'll be like, wait a minute, how do I give this app permission? So now this application has permission to access this Key Vault. So I click next, and I click create. That's one of, if not the most important part of this configuration. We'll click next. Yes, enable public access, allow access from all networks. Click next. And by the way, if I go back here, we have a lot of customers that use like our Reveal SDK, etc. Make sure that you have your firewall set up correctly. So if you have IP ranges that you want to allow access to things like the Key Vault, your web APIs, your databases, every networking tab ends up being very important for that. Let me click next here, and let's click create. So now we're deploying our Key Vault. Deployment is in progress. And now the next step is when this is complete, we are going to tell our application to actually use it in Azure. Then we're going to go modify the code in Visual Studio to pull from the Key Vault. So it says your deployment is complete. Let's go to our resource. There's our Autos Key Vault Demo 1. And now we create the actual secret that is stored inside of Auto Key Vault Demo 1. So we're going to go to secrets on the left-hand side, and we are going to generate or import a secret. So upload options are manual. The name of this secret will be Azure, or actually it'll be Auto API Demo Secret 1. And we need to enter the secret. So the secret is actually our connection string. That's all of this is to get the connection string encrypted online so Azure services can actually use it. So let's go back here. I'm going to move this off the screen so I can safely copy all of my username and password info. So let's go to, let's paste it in there, and you can see that it is pasted. So I have Auto API Demo Secret 1, and we can move Visual Studio back. We'll minimize it. I am going to copy this as well so I don't forget it. Let's go back here and paste it in my notes. all of these things end up being important because you need to use them in other places. So you want to make sure that you have them handy. Okay, we won't set an activation or expiration date. It's enabled, so let's go ahead and click create. So now this secret is created within our Key Vault. So now how do we use that Key Vault in our application? The first thing we need to do is add a couple new NuGet packages. These NuGet packages will allow us to access the Azure Identity Service and the Azure Key Vault. So let's go ahead and type in Azure Identity. Actually, Azure.ident I think will work. And let's see, here we go, Azure.identity, and let's install the latest stable. And we will also then search for the Azure Security NuGet package. Security. And it's actually azure.security.keyvault.secrets because that's what we're going to access. We want to do the latest stable, and let's install that. Now, if you remember when we connected to our basic Azure SQL or our local SQL server, we were just doing a get connection and we were using user secrets or the default DB context. What we need to do now is remove this because we want to access the Key Vault. And remember, the way we access the Key Vault is through that Key Vault URL. How are we going to get that Key Vault URL in the app? Well, we are going to add it to the app settings. And the reason we can add it to the app settings is because it's harmless. There's really nothing anyone can do with this URL unless they have our authentication to Azure. Like, for example, in my case, it's my IP address. In your case, you could have a token, IP range, or an application name. It's really up to you. So I'm going to go to the toolbox, and I happen to have here my Key Vault entry. So I am going to add this vault key is going to be the name that I look for when I get the configuration. And then this is the URL that I want to go up to the server. Now, this is not the URL that we were using because this is one I was using earlier. In testing, I want to copy the one that I copied earlier. So it's called Auto's Key Vault Demo 1. So it's Auto's Key Vault Demo 1. How do you know that? Let's refresh. We can go back home. We can go to Auto's Key Vault Demo 1. And there you've got the URL. So this URL is what's important. And then if we go to secrets, what are we going to get out of that URL? This secret name. So I guess I'll copy it. I do have it over here. Auto API Demo Secret 1. We'll actually see if we can remember that. Let's go back to Visual Studio. So I want to get this vault key. How do I get that vault key? And while we're at this, let's go to our user secrets. So I'm going to go to Manage User Secrets, and I am going to comment all this out just so there's no doubt as to what's actually happening here. There's no other connection string in this application at this point except a URL to the cloud. So let's go to program.cs, and I'm going to delete this code because we are not going to use that method of getting the connection string. I'm going to go to my toolbox here, and let's add these 4 lines of code. Now these 4 lines of code are using similar, so we're going to use builder.configuration. What configuration? Vault key. Of course, vault key is what I added to my app settings. And then we're going to create something called the secret client. What is the secret client? Well, the secret client is what is at the endpoint that is at the vault key. So I want to pull that in. Now, secret client is of the Azure Identity or Azure Security Key Vault secret. So we need to add that using statement up here. And then we need to add the Azure.identity. So we'll go ahead and add that as well. So using Azure Identity. So now what do we do next? So the next thing is we are going to get the actual secret. So of course I already forgot what the secret was called. Let's copy this. The secret up at our URL is called Auto API Demo Secret 1. What's an Auto API Demo Secret 1 is our connection string. And this is a standard connection string. So it's, database equals, user ID equals. So it's exactly what you would use on any database. Now, at the same time, if you want to know what the exact connection string should be, you can always go to your database. Let me go to SQL databases, and then within the SQL database, I have connection strings. So I can click on connection strings, and this will tell you exactly what to put in. So you can see this is what I actually had in my configuration. User ID dev, I had my password in there. So depending on how you're connecting, what your server or client is, or your driver, you would use these guys. So let's go ahead and minimize that, go back to here, and I'm actually all done. That's all I needed to do. So I changed 4 lines of code here, which are going to point to the URL in the cloud, in the Key Vault, to get the encrypted connection string. So let's go ahead and run this, make sure it works. Now, the first time you run this, it might take a few seconds because it's going up to Azure. It's authenticating your application for the first time against the principal in Active Directory, so it knows that it's authorized to access this encrypted Key Vault data, and then it's going to pull that Key Vault data into our application. So now if I run this, try it out, execute, and we will see data. So just like that, I get all of the data that I had before. Now, if I close this out and let's just set a breakpoint here, let's run this again. And at our breakpoint, we can look at some other information that we've pulled in. So we've got KVS here. So I've got my auto API demo secret, and then of course my connection string. So all of this was just pulled in from Azure Key Vault. We're done. So what do we do now? The next thing we need to do is commit all of this to GitHub. So let's go to Git changes, and there was a bunch of different changes. I'm just going to say updated to Azure Key Vault for connection. I'm going to commit everything, and then I'm going to do a pull, then a push. And let's go back over to the browser, and let's go to github.com/jbarris and take a look at what's happening here. So I'm going to go to my repositories, and here's our Autos API Demo 1. Now let's go to our actions. So this is where it gets really cool. So you can see that it's merging branch master of GitHub JBarris Autos Demo 1 up to the cloud. So this is the workflow build and deploy. If I go to my code, we go to GitHub workflows, master autos API demo 1 YAML. This is the script that was created by Azure that does the actual deployment or the build and then deploy to the server. So let's say, for example, that you messed up and you want to delete your API app in the cloud. All you need to do to stop this like check-in continuous deployment is click the delete file, and that will automatically delete this job from happening. So there is no trigger that would happen in that case. But anyway, so this is going to merge. This will take a minute. And when it's done, we will take a look at our application in the cloud. So we have the green checkbox. It looks like everything was complete. And the way we can test this is by simply going to our Swagger API. Let's do a refresh to make sure that it is the latest version. You can see it's taking a second to load because the application was literally just redeployed. So the application restarts. Now let's click try it out. We'll click execute. Now this is doing all that same stuff we did locally. It's going to the Key Vault through that URI. It is pulling out the secret, and look at that, we have data. So we have successfully deployed our web API to Azure with an Azure SQL database using an encrypted connection string. So nothing is in our code that would expose us to a security risk. And the Azure Key Vault is pretty much the most secure option you have for storing any app configuration, especially your SQL connection strings. The nice thing is, let's say you're using a different Vault client like HashiCorp, and there's others. They all integrate in with Azure. So you're not limited to the Azure Key Vault. You can use any Key Vault that you like. So that's it. We've taken an application, started from scratch, end-to-end, built an entire cloud-based app using Visual Studio and .NET with Web API. And now what we can do is just consume this like any other API in our application. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this URL. I'm going to open up a new browser window, and I'm going to go over to App Builder. So inside of App Builder, I'm going to create a new application. So let's do a new app. I'm going to use a template. I'm going to use a blank template. And in my blank template, I am going to drag a grid onto the form. So let's drag a grid onto the form like so. And I am going to then add a data source. So let's add plus REST API. I want to use Swagger. I'm going to add my URL. Of course, I'm going to add my brand new web API. Click done. There we go. Configure my endpoints. There's my autos. Select data. Select all. Click done. Select my grid. Let's go over to the data tab and let's select our autos API. And now I have a real live business application with real live data coming from Azure. And I want to do a Blazor server app here. And I can do a preview. So this is my application, has all my data, everything that I would expect. And then of course, all of the generated code that I need to build out my entire app. So just like that, you now can consume that web API in a real live Blazor Angular web component application using App Builder without writing a single line of code. Okay, so before we wrap up, that was awesome. Great job, Jason, on that demo. Can everyone please take the poll? We're going to kick off the poll, and it's about 5 questions or maybe 7, I forget. We added a couple new questions. What we're really interested in is if you're using Azure, are you using Azure SQL? Are you using Azure API apps? Like, what is your story for the cloud, or are you still on-prem? Because we can tailor content to where you're doing your development. I think in Q2 through Q4 this year, we did a lot of cool demos around Entity Framework, around creating web APIs with SQL Server and all that, all kind of in relation to App Builder. While we didn't spend a lot of time on App Builder in this particular webinar, we will in the future because there's more and more features that really matter to you, and we really want to make sure you know how to use those features. But please answer the questions in the poll. If there's other things that you think we should have asked but we didn't, just go ahead and type it in the chat and give us, your thoughts. And of course, you can email myself, Brian, George, doesn't really matter, any of us, with what you are thinking. So please get App Builder today. We've got appbuilder.indigo design is where you log in. Our playlist up on YouTube, which is ever growing, has more cool videos there, and we're constantly adding more content. With the new Blazor capability, with the new web component capability, it's really getting exciting. And with this release coming in a couple weeks, when you be able to add column templates, when you can do just more and more of code that you would normally have to write yourself, we're going to remove that from you. And then early Q1, when we finally get that master detail done, it is really exciting. So we're just opening up more and more of your time to spend on what's important versus writing tedious, error-prone, and mundane code. So January 26th is the next webinar. We are going to focus solely on App Builder. There are so many new features to show inside of App Builder. So George and I will be doing those demos. It's pretty exciting, and I can't wait to get it into your hands. The new stuff in December, and then everything that we're going to be shipping in Q1. So I'm very excited about that. And we won't be having demos like this until the new year. So I hope everyone has a good holiday season as well. And I want to thank everyone for continuing to support us and to join these webinars to learn about technology. So thanks again. This is my email, Brian's email. We're going to stay online and make sure that we answer every single question. If you could keep finishing up those poll questions, we really appreciate it. And thank you again, everyone, for attending today's webinar.